kind of do them.
So real quick before you start, Brad.
Yep.
So we're going to mute everybody, and then I'm going to lock the mute. So please use the hand raise function and the chat function, and make sure you chat to everybody, because Brad Sumter is going to be working on the presentation, and then we're going to interrupt him as necessary to clarify any questions. When we get into the second half of the presentation, I will unlock the mute. You will still be muted, but if you want to ask a question at that point, you can click your microphone button and it will allow you to talk. So that'll be free and open conversation after we do this first part. So anyway, so if you find you cannot unmute, just raise your hand. So everybody should be muted. Brad Sumter, you're muted. And okay, so yep. Okay, so Brad, you got the floor.
Okay, thanks. I was like, I was on a different screen and you mute. I was like, oh, I don't even know how to get back to unmute myself. All right, hey, thanks everyone. My name's Brad Sumter, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about swarm prevention and control. You'll see, I originally planned on giving this talk back in March, but that's right when all the coronavirus quarantine stuff kicked in. And so we missed those couple meetings, but here we are today, and we're going to try to do this via Zoom. So thank you everybody for joining us via Zoom. So I know this is new for a lot of folks, including myself, I guess. Probably really the first presentation I've given over Zoom. So hopefully if you have questions, just put them in those couple different places we mentioned, and Mike or Brad will cue me to try to answer them, or they can answer themselves too via chat pretty easily. All right, so one of the reasons I wanted to talk about swarm prevention and control, I've been keeping bees for a couple years now, and then last spring I was helping do some work with some nucleus boxes or nucleus colonies, and I found myself in the middle of an ongoing swarm. We were working in a small colony, and all of a sudden there was buzzing all around, and I looked up and there was a cloud of thousands of bees above us, and just buzzing, and they were slowly drifting off to the side. It took me a minute to kind of understand what was going on, but it was absolutely amazing phenomena to find yourself in. And so tried following that swarm as it slowly drifted off. Went through a gate, and then they made it to a fence, and I couldn't follow them anymore, and lost sight of them as they went into some trees. But it was a really, really interesting experience. And it kind of got me started thinking about, well, shoot, swarms, these bees swarm, and I don't want my own bees to swarm. So what do I need to know about that, and how do I prevent that, and how do I control it? So that's kind of the genesis of how I started thinking about this, and maybe we can walk through it. This is kind of geared more towards the newer beekeepers. I'm sure, as Brad already mentioned, when we had, if there's 37 people, we'll probably get at least 43 answers. I would say probably more than that. But this is, I did a bunch of research here, and I think we have some of the best solutions for swarm prevention and control. There's lots of others out there, and there's lots more opinions that I don't even get to here. All right, so what is a swarm? So a swarm is basically the way a honeybee colony reproduces. So it's very natural in bees in nature. That's how they reproduce. So the queen and about a little over half of the workers, usually the younger nurse bees, the ones that can fly, will depart the hive, and then they'll search for a new home. And then before they do that, they will produce a bunch of queen cells in the original hive, and those queen cells will then hatch out. And it's possible that that colony will either issue another swarm, or the bees will get back to work and reestablishing the colony. So one of those two things. And it's possible that a hive could issue 3 or 4 or more swarms. They get smaller all the time, but once it gets to a certain point, and this isn't super well understood, but a certain point they'll say, okay, we're done swarming, and they'll work on reestablishing the swarm there. So that picture on the right is another, a different colony that I got a chance to help capture last year. And one of the things about swarms is when they're in the swarming mode like that, I talked about that cloud of bees earlier, this, you can see this swarms, it's all hanging from this tree limb just before dark. They're pretty docile. They're not aggressive at all. You can walk right up to that, and it's just something to be aware of if you ever come across one. A lot of Non-beekeepers are then quite startled or scared by the swarming behavior, but as a beekeeper, it's pretty easy to work with these bees. All right, I just wanted to talk about that for a second. But if we go back to the kind of pros and cons of the swarm, so in nature, it's really a pro because it results in 2 or even more honeybee colonies out there. Uh, it creates a brood break, which is results in a natural reduction of varroa mites. Now that is an entire presentation all of its own. I don't want to get into it too much here, but I just wanted to mention that it would cause that brood break, and it's a natural way that natural bees can reduce their varroa loads. Also, just diversifies genetics, gets those bees out there mating with some new queens, reproducing with more drones from the local area, and it's going to spread the genetics across the area. So if you're a beekeeper, it's a major con because you just lost at least half your bees. And then also, if you're you're going to lose your honey production, or if you're a pollinator, you're going to lose a lot of that pollen production as well. And we already talked a little bit about non-beekeepers, but a swarm could definitely be a nuisance to your neighbor. They see them, they look pretty scary when they're all up in the air like that. And so it's just something to be, as a conscientious beekeeper, you want to take good care of your bees and then not create a hassle for your neighbors, just to keep everything easy for you. So a colony will normally swarm in the springtime, just before and during the beginning of the honey flow. Sometimes they'll swarm in the fall, but we're mostly going to focus here on the springtime. Once you get into the honey flow, the bees are concentrating on that, and they're less likely to swarm. So that kind of that drive to swarm kind of dies down a little bit. So what are the conditions that drive swarming? Swarming is not perfectly well understood, but one of the main causes is congestion in the hive, and that can be just a lot of bees in there, or could be that there's not enough space. Could be a lot of things, and including even if we have bad weather where the bees aren't able to get out and fly, that can kind of lead to that congestion filling within the hive, and kind of can lead up to swarming if you have an extended period of bad weather. Just to move on real quickly, a lot of the other things that will be kind of conditions that you expect to see is there's not much open space for the queen to lay eggs in. A lot of times you'll see an area of a frame where the larvae, the bees have hatched out, and normally the queen would come back and relay in that area, but instead the bees have backfilled that with nectar or pollen and doesn't give it any space left for the queen to lay, and that can be another driver to swarming. So in the spring buildup, as the day gets longer, as they start to have some nectar and pollen come in, a colony may realize, hey, conditions are good, we got the strength, we got all the resources available to issue a swarm, and that may also drive the beginning of swarming conditions. And then there dilution of the queen pheromone, particularly the mandibular pheromone, which is spread from bee to bee by touching the queen. If you have a ton of bees in there, maybe that it gets diluted because there's so many bees that they can't, it's not very strong as it gets to the bees that are farther away from the queen, or it could be that the queen is getting old and not producing as much of the pheromone. There's several causes for that, like queen age, for example. So there's lots of different causes, but these are kind of the main drivers. Basically, we're going to use this to divide our talk here and our procedures and techniques of what we do. Is when eggs are laid in a queen cup and the cells are capped, we're going to call those swarm cells, and that's going to be the driver or the distinguisher for us, whether we're talking about swarm prevention or swarm control. But I guess bottom line, when the hive is extremely crowded, that's going to be a strong driver for swarming. So what is a swarm cell? You'll see down here at the bottom, these are a lot of swarm cells down at the bottom of the frame. Most of the time, swarm cells are down here at the bottom of the frame, although you'll see some up higher, places like this. Those are kind of the normal types of conditions where you're going to see the swarm cell, and we'll talk a lot more about this. But basically, what's happened is the bees have all been working in unison. The bees have built these cells down here. The queens come down here and laid laid in them, and eventually they get fed royal jelly, and the workers cap these, and everybody's working together in harmony to create these swarm cells. And I'll just talk about that now, but I'm going to talk about it a lot more later. So I kind of said, hey, when those queen cups, those capped queen cells, swarm cells are produced, that's going to be a kind of divisor whether we're doing swarm prevention or swarm control. And there's a couple different ways to handle it. And part of it goes into what are your goals for the upcoming season. In some cases, you may want to turn those into splits. Sometimes you may not, depending on whether you think you are at how many hives you have and how many you want, how many you're able to take care of. Also, whether you're really into honey production or what your goals are for the season. And so if you think about that in the winter time or in the fall, really, kind of the beekeeping year begins in the fall, you have time to get everything that you need together. You're going to have to build, if you're going to do splits and stuff, you either need to acquire nuke boxes, build them, build snell grow boards, all these different types of things that you may need. But you want to have all this stuff ready because once spring comes and they get to the swarming activity, it happens pretty fast and you'll need to be ready. So for swarm prevention, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different ways to do swarm prevention and kind of so we never get to that point where they're capping those queen cells and making swarm cells. But in the case that they do, we're really going to talk about two methods for how to do swarm control. They're basically all artificial swarm methods to make the colony think that a swarm has occurred, and then that way the urge to further swarm dies down. All right, so we're going to think about it in two pieces, and we're going to take the first piece, swarm prevention, first. Before we do that, let me just take a second to talk about some bee behavior and some of the things that we're going to take advantage of, or we're going to talk about in these different techniques that we're going to talk about. So first off, flying bees tend to return to the location which they're accustomed to flying. So once they get used to flying, they know where their colony is and they've got all the landmarks mapped out in their brain, and that's where they want to go. To them, that's home, and that's where they try to go. And you'll see a couple techniques that we use that take advantage of that. Now, there's also this idea that bee clusters, or the brood nests really, in managed hives tend to move upward. You'll see I put on the side of that this can of worms type icon. In all things beekeeping, sometimes there's just not much agreement on exactly what the case is. So you'll see lots of arguments between beekeepers whether brood clusters really do move up or if they move down, and partly that's because in nature, nobody's going to go move around for them. They have to move down once they start attaching comb at the top of a nest inside of a tree. But for managed hives, I think the general consensus is that generally hives tend to move upward, and we'll take advantage of that. I mentioned this before, but when swarms leave, they take the queen and young bees to form the new colony. These are younger nurse bees, but they're old enough to fly. So they're just kind of the younger bees. The older bees and some of the nurse bees then are going to be left in the original colony and they to tend to the queen cells and reestablish the colony. And then we talked about this as well, that bees lacking queen pheromones. We talked about that being a driver for swarming, but before bees swarm, they're going to rear queen cells so that they can reestablish that colony. They're not going to just abandon it totally. So those are a few things just to keep in mind as we go through. You're going to see this can of worms icon in a few different places as we go through this presentation. And those are all areas where, hey, there may be quite a bit of disagreement among beekeepers, but I've tried to present you information that is the most accepted or widely accepted as possible. All right, so here are the different swarm prevention measures we're going to go through, and I'm going to walk through each one of these, so we'll just go ahead and step in. So one of the ones I think is the easiest and that I like to start with in the spring is called equalization. And basically, this is just moving resources from stronger hives to weaker hives. And that way, the stronger hives aren't quite as strong, they're not going to swarm as soon, and it gives us makes all my hives more equal, so I can kind of apply the same management strategies across them as much as possible. Every hive's going to be a little bit different no matter what, but this tends to make them a little bit more the same. So basically, in the springtime, what we go through, and you can do this anytime throughout the beekeeping season, but kind of assess your hive, and you can move resources from the stronger hives to weaker hives. So that could be cat brood, it could be food resources like pollen or honey, nectar, and then what you're doing is taking those weaker empty frames from the weaker colonies and moving those into the stronger ones, or you're putting foundation or something like that, empty wax into the stronger ones, so they'll have room for the queens to lay, and they will need to go back and redo some of that food gathering if that's what you move. And I think that just basically keeps everything closer to the same, reduces the strength of some of the strongest ones usually in the spring is when you try to do this. All right, so I talked about this being this is going to take advantage of that first can of worms thing I talked about. So if you have multiple brood boxes, so if you're just starting out, this won't be the case for you. But if you have multiple brood boxes, determine if the upper box is full of bees, if it's congested. And if it is congested, you can move this to the bottom of your hive. And so we're going to see lots of kind of images like this as we go through the rest of the presentation. So I'll take just a minute here. But so this is our first case where we found it. The red indicates the brood frames. We had a lot of brood up at top, and there's some honey stores or pollen on the sides. No hive is going to look exactly like this. So you're just there's going to be a mixture of everything on each one of these frames, but this is just ideally the frames that have the most brood kind of in the upper box, and frames that don't have much brood or none on the bottom. You could switch them. This is called reversing the brood boxes. On the next slide, I'll talk about that just a little bit more. Because I said, hey, this is one of those areas between beekeepers. In a natural hive, they can never swap the brood boxes like that. They will eventually move down. My question is, how does that impact swarming? And that's what we're trying to control here. So our goal by performing this type of management is to avoid swarming. I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if anybody does, but that's what we're trying to prevent, is that swarming. And this is a well accepted method of trying to do that, and usually first thing in the spring. There's one thing that we definitely want to avoid is we don't want to split the brood chamber. So if the brood nest is split between kind of the top brood box and the bottom brood box, what we want to not do is to reverse those boxes where we put a big gap in the middle of the brood box. So we definitely want to avoid that scenario. So that's the main thing to look out for. Otherwise, swapping the boxes is pretty harmless. It could help you. I don't think it's going to hurt you unless you do this. And so definitely don't do that. All right. So we talked about congestion being a major driver in swarming. So one of the things that you can do is adding additional space for the colony to work with. So it could be adding brood boxes. If you only have one brood box, even if you have two, you can add another brood box on there, and a lot of beekeepers do. So it could be a solution is to add another brood box on there so they have space to lay. And then also, if you're talking, if it looks like your hive is honey bound or nectar and pollen are taking up a lot of the space, you can add especially a honey stupor so they can store that nectar up there. Nectar processing requires extra space, so they can dehydrate that down into honey, and so they'll need some extra space to store all that nectar while it's being condensed down into honey. So that's pretty normal too, especially around this time of year. People start adding their honey supers just as before the nectar flow really gets on. All right. So now we start moving to stuff that's a little bit more complicated, I guess. This is the Damari method. It's a very, very old beekeeping method from the 1800s. It's been around for a long time. So in this case, you're looking at a pretty full colony. So we're looking at the before picture over here on the left. The symbol is going to represent the queen. So some of the methods I'm going to talk about, you need to be able to find the queen. Some of them, it doesn't matter whether you can find the queen or not. I'll try to illustrate that through these different pictures, whether you need to be able to find her or not. But the idea for the Damari method then is you're going to move most of the old frames up here. You're going to add a new box down here, two frames of brood, and then also move the queen down into this new box. You'll put a queen excluder, any honey supers you want to add there. And then up here, you're going to have most of what was there before the original hive. So now you've got a big gap here. And so the queen, she wouldn't normally move across honey anyway, honey frames, but we put that queen excluder. She can't go up there. The only thing that can go up there, but the worker bees can still travel back and forth. So they can come down here, visit the queen, get that queen pheromone, and they can carry it up here where they're going to take care of the brood. But depending on the pheromone distribution, you may see the appearance of these queen cells up here. And so you gotta kind of manage that depending on what your goal is. And this can be a desirable thing if you're looking to split your hives or produce nukes or something like that. But you want to manage that, and you'll have to wait until that's a risk that those queen cells are going to appear up there until all the larvae are capped. Then once there's no new eggs up here, then you don't have to worry about that, of course. One more slide on this, and basically by moving that brood at the top, it attracts those nurse bees up there. It reduces that congestion at the bottom. But the Damari method makes use of this kind of, they call it a frame cycling system or frame circulation system, and so that you would move new frames of brood from the bottom up to the top. But one problem with the Damari method is if you leave those brood frames up there too long, it's possible they may get filled with nectar, and that's something you probably don't want to happen. Is you don't want honey to end up in your brood frame, so that may present a problem for you when you go to harvest. So it's just something to be aware of. So getting out of this relieves the congestion basically, so that relieves the pressure to swarm. But I think there's other methods that you might like better, but this is one that's been in use for a long time and it's worth considering. Okay, another way to reduce that pressure is to actually perform a split. So now I'm going to take enough resources out of a hive so I can build a brand new nuke box or nook, as some people say, and that's going to lighten the congestion in the original hive so that you'll remove the pressure to split. So these are just the basic steps for how you would build that nuke. I'll let you look through there, but basically you're moving the brood and some resources over to a nuke box or a new hive altogether. You'll add some feeders, foundation, whatever you need to complete that box. You're going to put the empty frames in the original hive, and then with that nuke, you have some options on how you want to get a new queen. So you can allow the bees themselves to build or to make an emergency queen with any eggs or larvae that you moved there. You can insert a swarm cell from another hive, or you can install a mated queen. Those are all different options. They have different pros and cons, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go through the rest of the presentation. All right, so this guy named L.E. Snellgrove was a very prolific beekeeper in England in the 1930s, and he has a couple of well-known methods for swarm control mostly, but so we're going to talk about this method here in swarm prevention, and we're going to call it Snellgrove Method 1, and it's been modified a little bit from the original for a lot of different reasons. The Brits use some different types of styles of boxes than we use here in the US. They don't use the Langstroth hives for the most part. Similar stuff, but different things, and they have a bunch of other different things they do. So this is what our situation looks like in the beginning. And we have a very full box, but we want to do a split. And so we're going to take a lot of our original brood, stick it in a new box up above everything else. And I wish, we were here in person. We'd use a special board here. It's called the Snellgrove board. And on the next slide, I'll kind of show you what it looks like. But the next time we meet in person at the Bee Club, I will bring a Snellgrove board so everybody can take a look at it hands-on. And I'd like to show you how it works, but I'll talk you through this next slide. So this is basically a Snellgrove board. This is the side view of it. It's just about a little more than an inch tall, inch and a half tall, but it's got 3 pairs of doors, one on the top, one on the bottom, and in between there's this screen on the top and a screen on the bottom that's separated by the thickness of this piece of plywood normally. Oops, sorry. And what that does is it doesn't allow the bees that are below it to touch the bees that are on top, so they can't spread that mandibular pheromone back and forth. So the bees that are on top then realize that, hey, we're queenless, and that will cause them to produce these queen cells up here. So one of the things that's really good about using a Snellgrove board for doing a split is that it keeps a large working population of bees in the main hive once you've reduced the pressure to swarm, and that large working population will go out and produce a lot of honey. So if you want to do a split, but you don't want to impact your honey production, you want to consider doing a Snellgrove split, or the Snellgrove method 1. And what happens is you put this board on there. And so normally at the bottom of the screen, consider you're standing behind your hive. The entrance to the hive on the bottom, the original hive, is on the bottom. You're going to stack your frames. You have your brood boxes here. You're going to put this Snellgrove board in the middle. I'm going the wrong way. And then you're going to open this door that's on the top. So that's the entrance to your top hive now. And it's facing backwards. So all the other bees are working out here. The bees above the Snellgrove board are working in the back. Over time, you're going to manipulate these doors, so you don't have to do a bunch of other stuff. You just have to manipulate these doors. And you're going to, we talked about under bee behavior that bees like to return to their location. So this is separated by a very narrow distance. So what would happen if you see this is kind of the more brownish or orangish door on top was open. In my first manipulation, I'm going to close that, but I'm going to open the door that was just a little bit behind it. So the bees that were out flying or that exit the box, when they come back, they're going to try to come right back here. And they're used to going in this door, but it's closed. And this one's only less than an inch away. Excuse me. And so they're going to end up going in that door, which takes them back into the bottom hive. Because of this double screen board, they're still familiar with each other, their smells and stuff, but they weren't able to pass that mandibular pheromone back and forth. So those bees will be accepted in that bottom hive, keeps the population high, and they'll be working on producing your honey crop. While the bees above the board then are busy rearing those new queens and getting that second hive going. And over time, you would go ahead and manipulate this again to put the next crop of nurse bees that have graduated to flying down into the bottom box. And you can go through that over time to keep that population high in the bottom box after you've reduced the pressure to swarm. Okay, so at that beginning kind of flowchart slide, we talked about, hey, what are your goals for your beekeeping, right? So some people have reached the number of hives that they want. They're not looking to produce a bunch more hives. But we just talked about making splits. So some of the things you can do is you can recombine those hives if you desire at the end of the honey flow. And then you can do a lot of different things. So you can create a bigger colony that has during the honey flow with lots of foragers to go out there and collect that honey. But also because when we made that split, we came up with a new queen. You may want to be able to use that young queen to requeen one of your colonies with the older or weaker queen. And one of the ways so it's just something to consider when we're doing all these manipulations with splits and stuff. If you don't want to have all those hives in the end, you may want to recombine them. So one method to do that is with the Snellgrove method. Oh, sorry, the Snellgrove method, but first I'm talking about the newspaper method. So you just stack one colony on top of the other, but you're going to separate them with newspaper. And over time, you're gonna make a lot of people will make some slits in that newspaper. It doesn't matter either way. The bees over time will make their way through that newspaper, but it takes them a little while. And during that time, they kind of gotten used to each other's smell, and they merge as one colony with no problem. I guess I should say that there's only a queen in one of these two colonies, right? Before you try to combine them. So you would take the queen and do something else with it. And then you could also use that Snellgrove board that we just talked about. You stack one colony over the top. You separate them with the Snellgrove board if that's not already done. Maybe you were doing a Snellgrove split and that's how you got to this point. And so that shared split, the shared scent, they get familiar with each other. And whenever you're ready then, after a while, you can remove that Snellgrove board and you have one hive. All right. So there's a bunch of other ideas. I listed some of them here under, hey, these are ideas that are out there that you probably will hear about, but I don't think that they're the preferred method for swarm prevention. One of the things we talked about at the beginning was dilution of the queen pheromone. So a way to get around that is requeening, because a new young queen is usually going to produce a strong amount of the queen pheromone, which if the problem was caused due to an aging queen, then this might solve your problem. But because I think congestion is usually a larger problem than the dilution of the queen pheromone, I think requeening regularly is a good idea, but I don't think that's necessarily the best method for swarm prevention. So I prefer to do with a lot of the other methods we talked about first, with equalization, reversing the brood boxes, making splits, all these other ideas. Definitely I would requeen regularly, but I don't think it's the solution to, or the best solution for swarm prevention. Again, we talked about the idea that bees like to return to the place they're used to, the place they called home. One of the ideas you can do is you can swap colony positions within an apiary and move a weak colony and set it up on the hive stand where you had a strong colony before. And all those field bees that were out will return to that hive thinking, hey, that's where I left my hive, that's my home. And they'll enter there and that'll strengthen that hive. Um, I think this is just a more complicated way to do the equalization that we talked about earlier. It's possible to do this, and you'll see as we talk about some swarm control methods, I take advantage of this idea, but it's not something I would want to lead with as a way to do swarm prevention. I think there's just stronger, better controls that are easier to do than swapping these two colonies. All right, a couple more ideas is this idea of checkerboarding. I just wanted to touch on it here. You'll see the can of worms icon on both of these ideas. Um, checkerboarding is really about checkerboarding the honey frames above the cluster. I think it causes some confusion, but that nectar storage here can relieve some of the storage space pressure above the brood nest, but I think there's lots of other ways to get there. And then a method that I'm not real fond of is clipping a queen's wing. It doesn't do anything to reduce the impulse to swarm, but what it does, it causes the queen, she can't swarm. So, but what may happen is she may leave the colony, she may leave the hive, but she's not able to go anywhere. So unless you have a ramp or something for her to walk back up, she can't, she's not able to fly. So she really can't get back in the colony unless there is that ramp. And then now she's outside the colony or outside the hive. There's possibilities that she could be harmed by all sorts of other things, dragonflies, birds, what have you. And so I think it's just a lot more risk that you're going to put your colony in danger to do wing clipping as a way for swarm prevention. There may be other reasons to do that. I'm not familiar with any of them. I don't. Some people do. All right. So now let's transition. So all those other ideas that we just talked about were swarm prevention. Those are what we do before we find a capped queen cell, a swarm cell in our hive. If we find that we did all the other stuff because we were conscientious beekeepers, but we still, the hive was just growing so fast and was so strong, it's still looking to swarm. And now you've discovered that you have capped swarm cells in your hive. Well, that's going to take much more aggressive action to actually turn off that impulse to swarm. And I told you before that basically the ideas that we're going to talk about are actually artificial swarm methods. We're going to try to make the bees think that, yep, you have swarm. You can try to go in and destroy all those queen cells, but that really is only going to delay the swarm. And it's quite possible that you're not going to find them all because if there's a lot of bees in there, because we talked about congestion, it's hard to find all those queen cells, especially if you got some wonky comb, which your bees may like to produce. So I try to, the idea is to work with your bees, not against them. And their natural tendency in this condition would be to swarm. So we do artificial swarm techniques to try to convince them that, yes, they have swarm. So we're going to talk about two methods here. One of them's from Snellgrove, who we talked about in swarm prevention. We're going to talk about the Snellgrove method too, and we're going to talk about the Taranov method. There are a couple other methods, the Pagnon and Hedon method. They're not considered to be quite as successful as Snellgrove and Taranov, so we're not even going to talk about them here. We'll stick to just two, and then we'll wrap it up. All right, so that's what I just said. So here is the first method we're going to talk about for swarm control. And this is the Snellgrove method 2. You can use it with or without a division board. The division board being that Snellgrove board we talked about before. I describe it here without the division board, just to keep it simple, so you don't have to actually go out and produce a separate piece of equipment. You can just do this mostly with equipment most beekeepers have on hand. So this is what your beehive may look like before. When you discover all of a sudden, hey, I have a bunch of these swarm cells all over my hive. What am I going to do? So the blue is your original hive, and that's what it's going to look like here. So in the location of the original hive, I'm going to put a new brood box. I'm going to take a couple of frames that didn't have those queen cells, and I'm going to stick them in this new brood box. I'll put the honey stores or whatever on that location, and I'm going to move the original hive to some other new location within my apiary. And I'm going to have all those queen cells in there, and the queen will start over there. And so this is that process I talked about, is all these flying bees, hey, my home is over here. That's where they're used to going. So when they exit the hive to go foraging, when they come back, they're going to come back to this hive location. And so they'll go over here. And so that's greatly going to reduce the congestion within this hive. And so if I go to the next slide, this is what you're going to see about 9 to 10 days later. With these two frames that were they're the ones I moved that had eggs in them before. They're going to produce emergency queen cells there, and I'm going to move the queen from this hive over to here. Now this hive still had you'll notice that all those queen cells are gone up here. I would expect that normally, once I reduce the pressure for swarming, the nurse bees were going to tear those cells down. That's possible. If you're worried about it, you can go through and remove them yourselves as the beekeeper. And so you can either destroy them or harvest them for some other use. And we'll talk about that later. And then give it another 7 to 9 days. And so finally, the beekeeper will remove these queen cells. You have your queen in your new hive in the original location, and basically this was your artificial swarm, and you have your original hive in some other new location, and now it's produced all these emergency queen cells, and it will produce a queen from there, and now you have 2 hives. So that's the Snellgrove method 2. And that's for swarm control. Once you've discovered that you have capped queen cells in your hive, and you have to start taking much more drastic measures, aggressive measures, to actually prevent a hive from swarming. All right. So this method is called the Taranov method. It's somewhat simpler, but it requires some special equipment. And again, I wish we were at the Bee Club, because I've built one of these to show you. And next time we have an in-person meeting, I will bring it along so everybody can see it. But basically, you're going to build a ramp, and I have a picture on the next slide. And you're going to place it so that it sets over the empty hive body that you're going to have some comb and foundation in. And you're going to have a large piece of fabric, like I used a painting drop cloth to put it over this ramp. And then you're going to use the kind of light to help you a little bit. So you're going to face the ramp into the sun, because the bees are going to go try to get into the shade on the other side of the ramp, underneath the ramp. So you'll face this into the sun, and then you're going to shake or brush all the bees from your original hive that has queen cells in it onto that fabric, and all those bees are going to start marching up this piece of fabric, and then over the top, and then down a piece of fabric that hangs down into the box below. So all of your bees are going to enter this new box, and then you're going to put all your old frames that had the queen cells back in their original location. Once all the field bees finish this march, they're going to all return back to that original location that had the flying bees, are going to go back to that original location that has the swarm cells, and then you're going to have 2 hives. And I'll just show you here. This is kind of the ramp, and basically your hive body, your empty one, would be setting underneath here, and there's normally a piece of fabric that hangs down here, and I'll show you when we meet in person. And it hangs down in this box. All these bees are going to walk up here, come down underneath, and end up in this box, and the flying bees are going to fly back to the original location where the hive was, and that's where you're going to put the box back that has all the frames with the queen cells. And that's it. I recommend you watch this video on YouTube about the Terranov swarm if you're interested in doing it. It's a little hard to follow the video, but the guy does a great job of showing you how to do it. Adam Novit, and it's worth seeing. And I'll bring, like I said, the Terranov board to our next actual in-person meeting so everybody can see that. All right. So a lot of the different methods we talked about here dealt with queen cells. And so some of them were swarm cells, some of them were emergency cells. There was quite a variety in them, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But you may or may not need them for the method you're doing here, depending on whether you're trying to produce a queen. So what do you do with all those queen cells? So this is where I would encourage you to have some frames in your hive that are made with free comb. Basically, there's no foundation in there. You let the bees draw out all the wax on that frame, and it makes it easy that you can cut out these queen cells if the situation presents itself. And then you can use them for a lot of different things. You can move them to a queenless colony. If you have a bunch of colonies, it's possible you have a queenless colony, you could move it there. You could take the queen cells or frames with queen cells to start a nucleus box. And then again, lots of different options you can do with the queens from those nucleus box. Let me just talk for a minute, as I don't think this presentation would be complete without it. I am opening a bit of another can of worms here, but there's different types of swarm cells, or cells, queen cells. There's the swarm cells and emergency cells. So swarm cells are built under the best ideal conditions. The entire hive is working together to build the cups. The queen lays the eggs in those cups right where they need to be, and then the workers properly feed the royal jelly to those future queens from the very beginning. So that's the best built queen that you can find. Now, if you use those cells, then you're going to end up with a good queen. You'll hear a discussion, though, hey, are you selecting for swarming? So I think it's all on a matter of which swarm cells you harvest. So if you harvest swarm cells from a hive that seems to swarm prematurely, then yeah, you're probably selecting for swarming. But if everything seems to be normal with the hive and it just eventually produces swarm cells because it's a strong hive, it's going like gangbusters, and those are the properties you want to produce, you want to propagate this. The bees are calm or kind or docile, that produce a lot of honey, all these other good properties, then I think selecting from a swarm cell is the best possible case. Now, emergency cells, this comes about when the queen has laid eggs in normal cells on the frame, but now the colony realizes, hey, we're queenless. We need to produce a queen. And that may be because one of these methods we produce where we move the frames out of the colony with the queen to some other box. So now in this case, the onus is on the workers to promote the best candidates of those eggs or larvae that are there, larvae, to become queens. And so the workers then also either have to build queen cells around that around those larvae, or they have to move the larvae or eggs to a queen cell they produce somewhere else on the frame. And that's possible. It's just additional work and effort and risk to the quality of those larvae. The feeding of the royal jelly may not be optimal, and they may produce queens with fewer ovarials, which would be considered an inferior queen. Now, I think in most cases, the emergency queen cells are good, but they weren't built under the ideal conditions that the swarm cells were produced on. So in most cases, I think those emergency cells are good, but there are risks that you take if you propagate queens using those emergency cells. So it's just something that you should be aware of. Like I said, in most cases, I think they're fine. You'll be okay, but there are some factors that may result in them being not as good as a queen from a swarm cell. All right, one last thing, and I think that's it. So we did a lot of stuff on swarm prevention and even swarm control, but gosh darn it, those bees swarmed anyway. So one of the ways you can recover that is by catching that swarm if it's still near your apiary, Or if you put up some bait boxes in the local area, you may be able to track that swarm or another swarm, not from your apiary, but from a wild hive or from somewhere else, to take up residence in this bait box. And so there's a little bit of information about what a bait box should be, but it should be near your apiary. It's about the size of a lynx deep hive. Ideally, it would be placed about 15 feet above the ground, have a small entrance, include some frames with old wax and starter strips, and add some sort of lure like a lemongrass oil or scent there, and or another commercial product that can be used for attracting swarms. There's lots of references to this presentation. I would imagine I went through that pretty quick, so there's probably plenty of questions. I know I said it's geared more towards the newer beekeeper. I'm happy to answer questions from new and old, and I'm sure there's lots of other opinions on